Now, there was an investigation from LGBTQ publications, and it found that over 200 people have been refused HRT from the NHS this year. This is despite a quarter of those who have been recommended from an NHS gender clinic. So I want to ask you, how much of a role do you think the CAS review played in this?
Oh, it's fundamental in the withdrawal of UK trans healthcare across the board. I mean, the Hillary Cass report has been condemned internationally now. It's effectively a laughing stock. It includes studies on sheep. It quotes an undergraduate's essay where the spelling is absolutely terrible. And above all things, and this seems to me the most obvious, it was commissioned by Kemi Badenoch, who's made no secret of her contempt for the UK trans community. And the thought that Kemi Badenoch might appoint somebody independently minded who could potentially have come back with the verdict that gender affirming care works is just preposterous. Hillary Cass was cherry picked for the job. There were no interviews. She weeded out the studies that she did want and she didn't want. And to call it evidence based medicine, which is one of these buzz phrases, can you think of any medicine that isn't evidence based? To use that phrase about this sham of a report as if it's some landmark medical discovery is just absolutely preposterous. But what is interesting about the Cass report is that nowhere in it does Hillary Cass actually say that puberty blockers or hormone treatment should be withdrawn. However, because we live in this weird period of history where there is so much fear mongering and disinformation about trans people and about the trans healthcare being unsafe, certain GPs are now latching onto those words and using it as an excuse to say that they're not qualified to do what they've done for decades, which is absolutely preposterous.
It's really interesting that you said that because clearly the CAS review has been used for political motivation. And as you argue, and some of us argue, the CAS review itself was politically motivated. But in the CAS review itself, it doesn't say there should be a ban on HRT or puberty blockers, which tells me that politicians and even those working in the NHS are going further than the CAS review. I mean, are they not reading this report? I mean, if this is supposedly a really good evidence-based report, it seems like they're not even reading it and they're just going off fear mongering uh, itself.
Yeah. You're bang on, Curtis. I mean, at the end of the day, the Cass report is just there for justification. Their end goal is already set. I mean, for those who don't know, trans hate now in the UK and the US is actually an industry. It's a full-time job. They have offices on Tufton Street. They employ people. There's so much money behind it, either from the religious right or various billionaires and wealthy individuals. So it's a full-time job, 24/7, and they're lobbying government. And it's a very slow, gradual creep. And the end goal is the removal of all trans healthcare and actually the eradication, and yes, I did say eradication, the eradication of trans itself from society. And by that, I mean that if you end up living in a world where it's not possible to transition and you're not legally recognized um, as being a particular group or having certain rights, then you don't have to kill people, though that will happen inevitably and tragically because of the suicide rate within the trans community. But you don't actually have to kill everybody. If you actually wipe them from existence in a legal sense, then you no longer exist. And actually, the uh, the UN definition of genocide, there's 5 different definitions, and everybody thinks it's death camps and killing people, but it's not necessarily so. You can live in a world where there's a form of genocide that takes place, where you just make conditions impossible for a particular demographic to exist. And that is what's happening with the Cass report. The Cass report is actually one small part of it. It's being waved like a big flag as justification. Um, but I'm afraid the politicians, both Conservative and Labour, are now hell bent on wiping trans people out.
We are going to come on to the Labour Party as well in a second, but I want to go
Good.
back to the data. This data, it says that 73% of those who were refused were already on HRT. 45% have been on it for more than 5 years. So most of those refused are not taking it for the first time. I want to ask you, what are the effects and how harmful is it for those who have been on HRT for years, only for people to immediately stop due to a lack of access to them?
For those trans people who've fully medically transitioned, we no longer produce our own hormones. So we don't have any. So we rely on HRT for our bones. Without HRT, over a couple of years or so, we would literally start to crumble to dust and begin to disintegrate, which isn't great. And then on top of that, you've obviously got the cognitive ability. Hormones play a big part in all of our abilities to think and make decisions and to actually temper emotions, all of those kind of things. And again, if you're in a situation where there's a swathe of people in the population who rely on a particular medication um, to keep that level, and it's suddenly pulled, then there's going to be serious problems. It's actually no different from um, cis women who've been through the menopause. So if you suddenly withdrew their HRT, they would be in the same situation. They would be vulnerable to osteoporosis. Um, their ability to rationalize and cognitively function um, would be impaired, and your mood would drop as well. And obviously, because the trans population historically, the suicide rate isn't great due to all the bullying and the intimidation and generally being disenfranchised from society. Obviously, that has an impact as well. So it's a really serious thing long term.
Whenever we speak to people who call themselves gender critical, right, they'll say their side is based in evidence, it's based in facts. But what we know is, and you've just pointed to it there, that cis women can use HRT. Puberty
Mm.
blockers has been prescribed for decades on children for things that have nothing to do with gender identity. But suddenly, puberty blockers are called into question when it's used on trans people. So this surely proves that this whole gender critical movement is purely ideological, and it's just straight up transphobia. It's nothing to do with, oh, it's biology, oh, it's facts.
Yeah, it's 100% ideological, and it's all based on hate, and with the ultimate goal of wiping trans people out of society. There's absolutely no logic to it whatsoever. You've mentioned puberty blockers there. Now, puberty blockers have been around since the 1970s when they were first discovered in Holland. So we have over half a century's worth of data on puberty blockers. Nobody's ever been harmed by taking puberty blockers, but suddenly you have the health minister, Wes Streeting, calling them experimental. The same health minister, by the way, that is now giving out fat jabs to people who are unemployed, which have only been around for a couple of years, somehow they're not puberty blockers, as you've just mentioned there. When it comes to trans people, they're deemed to be experimental, life changing, and dangerous. Yet the very same medication at the very same dosage for the very same length of time are still prescribed to non trans children for something called precocious puberty. And that's when a child's puberty starts earlier than you would want it to. So you would take puberty blockers for 2, 3 years, something like that. And as soon as you come off puberty blockers, everything kicks in. The other thing I think it's worth mentioning as well, although they're called puberty blockers, um, trans adults at the beginning of their transition actually take puberty blockers as well. So I've taken them before, and all they do is they literally turn off your natural hormone production for a while you take the in my case it was estrogen. You take the estrogen, and that it just allows you to go through a normal puberty. So it's not as if you're not having a puberty at all. You are just having the puberty that you want, and the puberty that you want is actually no different from what the cis population would have. So it pauses your natural production of hormones to give the hormones that you do want a clear run to go into your body and change all the pathways, because all of us actually begin life as female for the first 6 to 8 weeks or so. That's who we all are. So everybody, or at least every guy in the world, although they can't remember it, has actually had a sex change, and we're all dependent on hormones. So yeah, the whole science and logic behind the gender critical movement is totally bogus. There is nothing trans people can do to satisfy them, and you see that in the news every single week, where anything positive towards the trans community, either something in sport, um, or somebody achieving something in politics or in the workplace, it's immediately pounced upon as being bad.
I want to touch up on something very important, which is transphobia also creeps into attacking cis people. I read a story recently where a cis woman was beaten up in a woman's bathroom because she was mistakenly trans. And it just goes to show that transphobia doesn't stop at attacking trans people. Ultimately, it will affect everyone, specifically cis women. But the sort of gender critical movement, they say it's about protecting women, protecting women's spaces. But actually, it seems to be steeped in misogyny.
Yeah, again, you're absolutely bang on the money. It's absolutely insane to me um, that a portion of the gender critical movement, because again, a lot of people think that the gender critical movement is just women, and it's not. A big proportion is actually guys, the sort of guys that would rock up at a Tommy Robinson event and will rant about any kind of minority out there. So they're a big part of the movement. And this idea that you can tell who is biologically cis, who is using a toilet just from your eyeballs, is absolutely ridiculous. And sadly, we are going to end up in a situation, just statistically, because obviously there are more cis women than trans women. You are going to end up with a heck of a lot of women who do not conform to what somebody might perceive as the correct way for a woman to look, being confronted. And there have been a number of incidents, as the one that you mentioned in the last week or so. There have been incidents in the States as well, where cis women have been actually cornered. There was a one in Ireland that I recall as well, and it's just an impossible path. I mean, if they ever did bring in gender critical law, LORE, um, whereby trans women, and it's only ever trans women, they never talk about the trans men. I'll mention them in a minute. Um, where they want to stop trans women going into toilets, how on earth are they going to police that? Are they actually going to have genital inspectors on the door? Are you going to have to drop your pants and somebody has a look? It's just completely unworkable. And you will end up with a situation which is kind of symptomatic of the whole world across the board on lots of issues at the moment, where we just end up living in a lot more violent and aggressive and confrontational society. And I certainly don't want that. And I don't believe the bulk of people do either.
I think once you explain it that way, once you come to this so-called logical conclusion, most people would say, well, this is ridiculous. I mean, why would we want to inspect people's genitals? And transphobia is obsessed with genitals, quite frankly.
Mm,
But I would like to actually talk about trans men because you mentioned it. There is a inconsistency here. Again, I call these people gender criticals, but it's just largely transphobes. Let's be honest here.
mm.
And they'll
Well,
say,
gender critical is a phase. Let's pick this up in a sec. But
okay,
it kind of sounds very sanitized and
yes.
almost intellectual and unacceptable. And that's obviously why they've decided on that term. But if you take away gender from gender critical, and by the way, it's not actually gender critical; it's transgender
Mm.
critical. But again, they're very cute about how they identify themselves and present themselves. If you take away gender critical and swap gender for black critical
Mm-hmm.
or gay critical or Jew critical, then all of these presenters on the likes of the BBC who are at the moment just so eager to welcome in the gender critical people as almost academic uh, level individuals giving a take on a subject, then the hairs on the back of your neck would prickle. Can you imagine them interviewing somebody who is black critical or Jew critical? It just doesn't stand up.
But it's the job of the mainstream media to pick that
Mm,
apart. I mean, you've just said it then. It's very easy to look into it and think, actually, this is completely unacceptable. But the mainstream media, rather than picking it apart, they platform them, which obviously, I have a lot of issues with the mainstream
mm,
media. But sorry to pivot back, but I just really want to pick up on what you said about the inconsistencies with transphobia in talking about women's spaces, talking about women and trans women, but they don't talk about trans men. I suspect if you had a male passing trans man, looks quite masculine. They go into the men's bathroom, but they say, no, you must go in the women's bathroom, even though they look quite, male passing and masculine.
mm.
They wouldn't say that. So clearly there's a huge inconsistency here in
Yeah,
talking about trans women and trans men.
yeah. They've never really addressed it. They've never come up with an answer to that, because the facts of the matter are, and if you never met a trans man, but you almost certainly have, you just haven't realized it. Go online and have a look at some photos of trans men. Now, with trans men, almost exclusively, because testosterone is a much more powerful hormone, and also the starting point that testosterone begins at is a lot more favorable for trans men. So nearly all trans men pass 100%. You could not pick a trans man out. They have beards, they have bald heads, they go to the gym, and they're really pumped and ripped. So yeah, they would be going in the ladies under gender critical law, which is another weird contradiction, which that they've never actually addressed. But also as well, just the way that they will talk about trans men as opposed to trans women is very, very different. With trans women, the themes are danger, threat, pervert, trickery. Whereas with trans men are almost infantilized. That they're seen as confused and they've been duped and tricked, and we should feel sorry for them and welcome them back into the fold, which is equally contemptible in terms of a take on people just living their lives and making their own decisions. And the fact of the matter is that in the UK, um, trans people have been using their preferred facilities legally at all stages of transition since the 1960s. Now, between 1960 and say 2017 is when I would say it started to kick off here in Britain. Between 1960 and 2017, there's never been an issue. There's never been a trans crime wave. There's never been an epidemic of predators pretending to be trans who are going in toilets and coshing people over their head and doing God knows what. It's all made up. Frankenstein's mob fear mongering.
There has been a huge shift in the mainstream media that I've noticed, and you've noticed, and many people have noticed over the last couple of years. That's really, really changed, and
Mm.
there has been a huge shift. Probably around 2017. So I like to talk about the media there. I mean, you said that transphobia is an industry in of itself. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, and unfortunately for trans people, we are vastly outnumbered, and we just don't have the resources to combat what now exists. So I would take you all back to the beginning. Where all this really started was in 2017. And in the US, they have this thing called, I forget the full name of the term, but it's an annual event. And basically, it's a religious right jamboree where all the religious right organizations in the UK, in the US get together and they have a great big event, big conference. And at this particular one, Donald Trump was attending. And one of the keynote speakers had stood up and made this speech about all of the sin in the world. And then they moved on to the fact that gay is still bad, but it's pointless attacking the gays because the gays are now accepted socially. People know gay people. If we tell them that the gay people are monsters, they're not going to believe us. They have rights. They are too well protected. But the weakly link in the chain is the T, trans. That's a harder sell to the public. So go home, start scaring women, start setting up organizations and focus on the T. And if you can break the T away from the LGB, then it leaves them more vulnerable and we can work on them at a later date. And literally, as soon as that conference finished, you had this explosion of women's rights, which is the disguise that they all go by, women's rights, an explosion of women's rights groups popping up all over the place, and also pseudo lesbian, gay, and bisexual rights organization. The most obvious one being the LGB Alliance. Notice the missing T, which I think was actually formed um, in that year, literally months after the conference. And the LGB Alliance will tell you that they stand, that they're not a trans hate movement. They just stand for lesbian, gay, and bisexual rights. But if you go on their website or look at anything they've ever done, every single conversation they have is about denigrating trans people. So you're now got this this climate where trans hate is, as I say, a full-time industry. They advertise for jobs, on organizations such as Sex Matters, which is JK Rowling's favorite gender critical pop-up. I like to call them pop-ups. They have an office on Tufton Street. They're intermixed with all the other lobby groups. They have access to ministers. Kemi Badenoch was meeting them regularly, but without telling anyone. They are just so well connected all over. And there are lots of these groups. And what you end up with is a situation where if an organization has done something trans positive, an example would be the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre in Scotland, which happened to end up with a chief executive who is a trans woman. They will look at tactics to actually change that, and they will use money. They will start to litigate, and they will exhaust the funds of small trans charities who can't compete with billionaires or money coming in from the US to fund all of these causes. And you end up with those organizations shutting down, further disenfranchising trans people in society. So it's an all-out war on all fronts, really.
Very interesting what you said about this US conservative conference, ultra conservative conference, and religious
Voters values voters. I remember the name. It's called the Values Voters Conference. Takes place every year. Yeah.
Now, of course, clearly their views aren't just transphobia; it is homophobia too. But obviously, as you mentioned, it's harder to go after these people politically. So they're isolating trans people, but obviously that is still a strategy for the long term
Yeah,
to go
it's a
after
long
all queer
term.
people. So when you see LGB Alliance, all these sort of groups, they pretend, oh, we're just speaking to those that are pro-queer, shall we say. However, when it comes to trans people, it's different. It's never about that. It's always conservative beliefs. I mean, I say this line: scratch a turf, find a conservative, find a right winger.
Yeah,
That's always what happens. I do want to pivot to the Labour Party, actually, more specifically Wes Streeting. Now, we've had Wes Streeting openly say that he regrets saying that trans women are women and trans men are men. He has said he supports the implementation of the caste review in full, obviously despite so many people criticising the review. So, in your view, is this Labour government, one, transphobic, and two, do you think they're no different to the Conservatives, or are actually worse on trans rights?
Well, it certainly feels worse because I know for myself, and I know for the rest of the trans community as well, we were kind of pinning our hopes on Labour, who you would think, looking at their history, champions of minorities and the disadvantaged, would absolutely stand up for us. And it's only 2 years ago that Keir Starmer, Annalise Dodds, and Angela Rayner stood at Camden Pride holding trans rights big lollipops like the lollipop ladies wear. What happened to all that? So yeah, it certainly feels worse what Labour are doing, which is nothing, than under the Conservatives, because you kind of expect a good kick in from the Conservatives. But the tragedy of it all is that, first of all, Wes Streeting shouldn't be in that job. He should not be health minister, because as an evangelical Christian who struggled with his own sexuality and fought it for a long time, I would argue that he's conflicted on this. There is a conflict of interest. I guess with Wes, he maybe feels that in some way he's redeeming his own sin. He's going to be saving souls. He's going to buy into the gender critical, warped logic that all trans people are actually just gay. and they just need a little bit of help. And if you don't let them transition, they'll just happily turn in to gay people, which is hokum. Because obviously, if you wanted to be gay, it's really easy. There's no hassle or stress. And if trans people were gay, they would just be gay. And there are gay trans people as well. It's not like you become trans and it's impossible to be gay. You're suddenly barred. So yeah, Wes is a really dangerous um, figure because of this commitment and stubbornness he's got about trans people now, where he won't even contemplate the idea that there's something wrong with the Cass report. But the big danger for trans people, and I think it's inevitable now, and this sounds, I know some people will listen to this and say, oh, well, look, you're exaggerating, you're being too catastrophic. But unfortunately, I can't see any way of avoiding this. So we have a Labour government now who at best are not going to do anything to protect the trans community. They're not going to reinforce our existing rights. They may even take some of it away by redefining what an actual woman is under the Equality Act. And waiting in the wings 5 years down the line are the Conservatives and Reform, or maybe a mixture of the two. And they are going to come in and they're just going to squash us. And we're going to be sitting ducks when that happens. You will have a full ban on trans healthcare. You will have a full ban in society of trans people using their preferred facilities, participating in things such as sport. And in terms of protections, as in hate crime, etc., I expect trans to be completely removed from that as well. So you're literally 4 or 5 years away from hell. That's what trans people are looking at. These, to me, now are our cabaret years. If anyone's seen the film Cabaret, which is all about Berlin, where it was all very friendly and welcoming and anything goes, but the Nazis are coming. That was the theme of Cabaret. And for trans people, these are our cabaret years. We can see them on the horizon marching towards us.
Let's move on to JK Rowling. You've had to report JK Rowling to the police because of tweets she made about you. How difficult was that process for you, and how do you think social media contributes to transphobia in the UK?
Yeah, well, JK Rowling is one of the main architects. She's got such a massive platform and reach that inevitably, whatever she says is going to have a big impact on social media. It's going to get a lot of likes, a lot of shares. And it's also going to be picked up by papers such as the Times, the Telegraph, the kind of heavyweight papers as well. So, in terms of the impact she has, she's appealing to the thug element, if you like, anonymous Twitter, all the grotty accounts that now follow her on social media. But she's also having a reach where she's hitting the more intellectual level of society, so doctors, judges, etc. And you'd have to be a blind man on a galloping horse not to recognize the fact now that J.K. Rowling is transphobic. It's a matter of fact. But could you say that on the BBC? Absolutely not. They would call her a women's rights campaigner. The big papers that I'm talking about there, the Times, the Observer, they all bill her as this champion of women's rights, when in fact she's just not. She's a trans hater. I don't know what's going to happen there. I hope for a while that there might be an intervention from a friend or a family member, because it seems to have completely taken over her life, consumed her, to the point now where, despite her immense wealth, she seems to spend all day in the castle tweeting a great deal about me as well. And when I went to the police to report JK Rowling for a hate crime, there was definitely, right from the get-go, an element of disbelief that, what, you mean JK Rowling, the children's author, the one who wrote Harry Potter? Are you sure she's saying these things? Are you sure she's being a horrible? I can't really believe that JK Rowling would do this. So I never really felt the police were taking it seriously. And there was a great reluctance to do anything. And I had to make umpteen statements. I had to push them in every way that I possibly could. I did end up with Northumbria police recording it as what's called a non-crime hate incident. Now, an NCHI is something that came in under the previous Conservative government, who didn't like the fact people were making reports of hate crime. So they made it a lot more difficult, and they broke it down into categories. And this is something that the general population may not know. I certainly didn't know at the time. If your demographic is race or religion, if somebody says something obviously racially offensive or offensive religiously, you can be done for hate crime. You don't need any other element to it. But if you're in any of the other minorities, so trans, gay, disabled, and all the other protected characteristics, you now actually need a separate crime to attach the hate to. So JK Rowling being just grotesquely transphobic to me is not enough. JK Rowling, to be done for a hate crime, would need to come round and set fire to my house or physically beat me up, which clearly is not going to happen. So the best you can have now, if you're not in the categories of race or religion, is what's called an NCHI. So there was no crime, but the police were satisfied that it met the criteria of hate, and that was recorded against JK Rowling. But yeah, she's a terrible, terrible person, and she's inflicting untold misery on people. So yeah, I have no time for her.
That's really astonishing fact. It's to say, well, this, I mean, it is a crime in itself. Hate crimes are crimes, but they're saying it's not actually a real crime. And people want to talk about two-tier policing. Well, it seems like some
Mm.
people are protected under this, but if you're queer, if you're disabled, it's not. Really astonishing. That's clearly not a consistent law. It must be changed. I want to thank you so much for giving me your experience of this. And I also want to thank you so much, India, for joining me today.
Been an absolute pleasure, Curtis. Yeah, look forward to doing it again sometime.